So let's talk about MVC. Now, you'll notice that ASP.NET MVC is named, well, ASP.NET MVC. Hopefully you noticed that because it's the name of this video series. Um, MVC is what's called a design pattern. A design pattern is basically a pattern of architecture or logic that is repeatable in some abstract way. It serves two purposes. It serves as a tool for learning, and it serves as a tool for communication, and it also serves as a tool for organization as well. So we can say three purposes. What I mean by that is, if you're a programmer and you're working with a new language, maybe this is the first time you're working with an object-oriented language, or maybe you haven't really looked at many object-oriented features. Design patterns offer a way to describe in an abstract way how to construct your classes and your objects to do something. Not necessarily to do something, but to fulfill a certain design goal. So they're repeatable. They're also identifiable. The idea about a design pattern, after the stage of learning, once you've learned them and you've practiced them, they serve as a very useful tool for communication. We can see an, we can see evidence of that by the fact that Microsoft named ASP.NET MVC ASP.NET MVC. They're communicating that this framework follows the MVC pattern. Now, there are a lot of frameworks that do follow the MVC pattern. There are also derivatives of MVC, and there are frameworks that don't follow the MVC pattern in particular or its derivatives. It's a very common pattern in web development and application development. It was actually invented many, many years ago, before it really became popular in the web world. But now that it has, you can't throw a stone and not hit at least 10 different MVC frameworks somewhere.
So, from a 3D background, this is kind of like I'm a Max user, maybe somebody's a Maya or a Blender user. These are the patterns that I would talk to them with. The names of the tools may change, but the way to do something remains the same.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
So we're going to be talking mainly about the MVC pattern, obviously, because that's what ASP.NET MVC uses. MVC stands for Model View Controller. It's an architectural pattern. When I say architectural pattern, it basically describes where you put your code. It also describes when you put that code somewhere, it describes what the purpose of that code should be and should not pass. It puts constraints on what classes can do what. So let's talk about these three categories, because you can think of them as three big buckets that we have in our project. The way I'm going to write this out is I'm going to have my model here, then I'm going to have my controller, and then view. That's because it'll be a little bit easier to diagram if I order it this way, but MVC again is Model View Controller. Now, your model is your business logic. What I mean by that is your model is the code that is responsible for performing actions that your application needs to perform. If you're writing an online store, you might have things like products and customers and orders and transactions. All those objects effectively go into the model. If, for example, you were writing a desktop application, you might have things that perform spell checking. Like you would have a spell check model that has the logic for performing a spell check action. The view, let's talk about the view now. View should be fairly self-evident in the name. The view is how your UI widgets get presented to the user. As we all know, we actually need quite a bit of logic to handle things like buttons and forms and web pages and all that fun stuff. Because we need so much logic to perform those actions, it's useful to separate that into its own little bucket called a view. So all your code that will handle the interaction with something, for example, the dialog window that would appear in Word if you were to hit the spell check button would be inside the view, whereas the logic that actually checks your spelling would be in the model.
So it's kind of opposite for like an artist type like me then. Model would be more like business model and view would be more like the actual graphical things. Is that correct?
That's mostly what I just described, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah, you did.
Okay, yeah.
But to somebody like me, that's kind of counterintuitive.
Well, it's important in code to be able to separate out our concerns into different buckets in our architecture. The reason it's important is that let's say I want to make a view. So I want to make a button or a form or a web page or something like that that just has view logic inside of it. Because I'm now working in a view, I am now no longer allowed to write any code inside of that piece of code, any code inside of the code that handles a button or a form that in any way could be considered to be the model or the controller. It makes it so your code becomes clean and separated if you follow the rules of the pattern. So the view, like I said, the view is what we look at. It's the buttons. It's the view would be, this drop down, or like I said, the spell check dialog box would be a view. It has its own logic, but just for view purposes. Like for example, it might have in a view you might have an autocomplete widget that automatically completes like a sentence. That would be a view concern because it's not really a business concern so much. The view allows you to see the actions you can perform as well as present you data, whereas the model actually performs actions in a more abstract and disconnected way. So, what's the controller? What do you think the controller is, Stephen?
I would at first think that it's a way to talk between the model and the view.
Exactly. Now, the controller is typically invoked by some external source. Now, that external source in this case might be ASP.NET MVC. When the controller is invoked by a source, it's going to do quite a few different things. Well, not necessarily quite a few different things. It's going to coordinate between the model and the view. In the case of ASP.NET MVC, exactly what it's going to do is it's going to communicate with the model. It's going to tell the model something to do something like gather data or perform an action. The model is going to return data to the controller, and then the controller is going to pass that data to the view, and then the view is going to present it. Now, in some MVC implementations, remember, MVC was created before it became popular as a web solution. It became popular back when we were still using FAT desktop applications. And in that case, sometimes the view would actually talk back to the controller, and then the controller would then forward that request to the model. The model would process that data, send it back to the controller, and the controller would send it back to the view. The reason I don't have this particular arrow inside of this diagram is because web frameworks like Ruby on Rails or ASP.NET MVC or Code Igniter or Laravel, they don't really work that way. The request pipeline looks like this. ASP.NET MVC says, hey, this controller needs to do something. The controller is like, well, I don't know exactly how to do that. I'm going to send the request off to the model. The model is like, okay, here's your data back. And then the controller is like, okay, view, do your thing. Now, what would happen if you wanted communication between the view and the controller? You would actually submit like a form, like a web form or something. And then by submitting that form on your browser, it would actually make a new request into ASP.NET MVC, which would then forward it into the controller, which would then talk again to the model, which would then pipe it into the view.
And that actually made sense. I'm astounded. Good job.
So this is MVC and how ASP.NET MVC kind of handles it. So let's talk. There are other MVC frameworks out there, or MVC-like patterns out there, I should say, like Model View Presenter and Model View View Model. Model View View Model is useful for it's a relatively new model that was popularized by Silverlight. And then MVP or Model View Presenter, that's useful when you have more fat controllers than what we have here. But obviously we're not talking about fat controllers, we're talking about lean controllers that basically delegate everything into the model and bring it back in. So that is basically the MVC pattern. But it's important to understand that just because we have MVC at this level doesn't mean we can't apply other patterns inside of one of these three buckets. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, your model might be implemented using DDD. or domain-driven design. That's an example that's commonly used. Or maybe your model uses CQRS or something like that. Your model can, in the context of ASP.NET MVC, your model is really whatever you want it to be. And you can write your own or use your own architectural design patterns inside of your model that still fits into the M of ASP.NET MVC, but they might have their own little buckets inside of them, their own little sub buckets. Like for example, DDD, you would have your services and your repositories and your aggregate routes. CQRS, you would have your commands and your events and your domain models and so on and so on. So the idea is don't fall under the trap of thinking that ASP.NET MVC in some way forces you to write your model in a particular way. You can take other architectural patterns and use them in the context of the model, and it would still be the model of the MVC. Same with the view. For example, with the view, we might use AngularJS. AngularJS is a JavaScript framework that Google makes that uses actually it's funny, the lead developer of AngularJS came up with a new MV pattern. He called it MVW, or model view whatever, because he got sick. He got like sick of people like saying, oh, that's not really MVC, that's MVVM, or that's MVP, or that's, he's got so tired of that he just calls it model view whatever. The point is that your view will have your own things inside of it. You might have another MVC inside of your view, or you might have another MVVM, or let's just say MVW, because that's a good one. So it's important to understand that you can expand any of these buckets and implement, I guess you could say, sub-architectures into them. And that's an important concept to understand early on, that ASP.NET MVC itself does not enforce everything to be as flat as you see with just the word model view controller. Instead, you can expand these buckets to hold whatever architecture makes sense for your particular project. Now, because this is a video series about ASP.NET MVC and not AngularJS or DDD or CQRS, we're going to be staying pretty flat. In fact, the model is going to be very, very thin, and our controllers are going to be handling most of the coordination. Point of showing this diagram, however, is that this is how conceptually ASP.NET MVC works, because you can again extend these buckets to do whatever you want. As far as the controller is tightly coupled to ASP.NET MVC. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video.
All right, so really ASP.NET is just this huge umbrella under which you can cover all of these different things. You're not that constrained.
Right, yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about how ASP.NET relates to ASP.NET MVC itself. ASP.NET MVC, like you said, it doesn't constrain you to really do anything, but it does give you these three buckets to fill whatever you want inside of them.
Cool.
Now, again, I want to stress this there's a very important concept that needs to be understood, and that is you have three buckets. All of your code is going to fall under one of these three buckets, or is going to be considered a ancillary, infrastructure concern, which means that you should always be aware of whether you are working with a controller or a model or a view, and you should only perform logic in one of those three things that's appropriate for that bucket.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I got it.
Awesome.
Ha!
Okay, so I think that wraps up our overview of the MVC pattern in the context of ASP.NET MVC. Again, ASP.NET MVC handles MVC in a different way than some other frameworks, especially frameworks that are focused on desktop applications and not websites. But this is just a basic overview of how it relates to this particular framework. So I think that just about wraps it up.
All right, awesome.